Across most of human history, the most dangerous person in a newborn's life wasn't a predator, a rival, or a stranger. It was the parent standing right there. Half of all baby girls born during the Stone Age may have been killed by their own mothers and fathers. Not as an accident, not as a failure, but as a decision. And that figure comes from academic research that held up for decades. What makes it stranger is that the reason most people assume drove that decision, starvation, desperation, and empty larder, turns out to be almost completely wrong. This video is about infanticide, when it started, why it happened, and what the real reasons were. Because most people assume this was a starvation problem, a desperate last resort when food ran out. And that assumption turns out to be almost completely wrong. The actual reasons humans killed their own babies are stranger, more social, and more uncomfortable than anything you'd expect. And there's one finding buried in the research from a population in subarctic Canada that accidentally dismantled an entirely separate theory about that same group of people. I'll get to that later, because once you hear it, you won't forget it. First, let's talk about the numbers, because they're the kind of thing that stops you mid-sentence. Anthropologist Joseph Birdsell estimated that infanticide rates in prehistoric times were between 15% and 50% of all births, while Layla Williamson put the lower end at 15 to 20%. Both of them believed that these rates persisted until the development of agriculture. And specifically for girls, comparative anthropologists calculated that 50% of female newborn babies were killed by their parents during the Paleolithic era. 1 in 2. Gone before they ever had a chance to take a step or say a word. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this was survival. These were people barely scraping by, living on whatever they could hunt or gather, and another mouth to feed was a death sentence for everyone else. That logic makes sense. It feels right. But here's the thing. When researchers actually went and looked at the documented reasons across cultures, the stated, recorded, cross-cultural causes of infanticide and hunger wasn't at the top of the list. Researchers Martin Daly and Margot Wilson found that victims of infanticide in human hunter-gatherer tribes were either not the parents' offspring, deformed or ill, or born under circumstances that weren't favorable for child-rearing. The single most commonly documented reason, across cultures, was that the infant appeared deformed or sick. Not starvation, not a bad harvest, the health of the baby itself. And that reframes everything, because it means this wasn't just desperate people making impossible choices about food. There was a logic to it. A cold, calculated logic rooted in whether this particular child was worth the investment. Whether this child could survive, contribute, carry on, it's brutal. But it was a decision being made with a kind of evolutionary accounting that most of us will never have to use. So the health of the baby was the leading reason. But the second most common trigger is where things get even more uncomfortable. Infidelity. A child born from an affair, or a child whose father was uncertain, was at dramatically higher risk. Victims were often children who were not the parents' offspring, meaning a man who suspected or knew the baby wasn't his was far less likely to invest in raising it. Alongside that, an unmarried mother with no partner to help carry the load, or the sudden appearance of twins, which doubled the burden overnight, were among the most frequently documented triggers. These weren't hunger-driven decisions. They were social and reproductive ones. The question wasn't always, do we have enough food? It was, is this child mine? And can I actually raise this child with the resources and support I have right now? Twins, specifically, show up across cultures as a particularly striking case. 2 babies at once meant double the nursing, double the carrying, double the energy, and in a world where a mother might need to travel miles every day to survive, carrying 2 infants was sometimes physically impossible, so one of them didn't make it. Not because the parents were monsters, but because the math didn't work. Now here's where the story gets genuinely strange, and this is the part I mentioned at the beginning, the case that accidentally blew up a completely separate theory. Selective female infanticide by the Dene hunting tribes of subarctic Canada is noted in the historical and ethnographic record. Unusually extensive and complete census data on 2 generations of Mackenzie Dene in the infanticide era showed male-skewed sex ratios, suggesting that the number of females in those generations was reduced through infanticide by 20% or more. 20% of an entire female population gone. Not through disease, not through war, but through deliberate selection at birth, generation after generation. But here's the part that nobody expected. These census data falsified the assumption of depopulation of the Mackenzie Dean by exogenous diseases in the historic era, rendering invalid the depopulation theory on which arguments for the loss of putative Aboriginal organization had been based. Scientists had spent decades assuming that the population decline in this group was caused by outside contact, by disease brought in by Europeans. The missing people, they thought, were victims of illness. But when researchers looked at the actual sex ratios in the census data, they realized the missing population wasn't dying from disease at all. They were girls who were never raised. The entire depopulation theory, built on decades of assumptions, collapsed because of infanticide data that nobody had connected to it. That's one of the most quietly staggering things in this whole field. A practice that everyone knew was happening ended up rewriting the demographic history of an entire people. So we've got health of the baby, we've got social circumstances, we've got sex-selective killing that reshaped entire populations. But there's another layer here that most people have never heard of, and it has to do with climate. Female-biased infanticide has been identified as particularly important for population control. Since females are the limiting factor in reproduction, population growth rates are reduced more by removing females than males. And this played out differently depending on where a group lived. Cold climate hunter-gatherers appear to have practiced infanticide at higher rates than warm climate groups, specifically as an adaptation to more frequent and severe food shortages. In environments where a bad winter could kill everyone, keeping the population tightly controlled wasn't cruelty, it was survival infrastructure. The harshness of the environment was directly shaping how many children were allowed to live. And alongside infanticide, there's evidence that many hunter-gatherer societies had methods for inducing abortion, used primarily by unmarried women who had no partner to help raise a child. The same social logic that drove infanticide also drove early termination. No support structure, no partner, no way to raise this child, pressin. And so the pregnancy ended before it became a decision about a baby already born. These two practices appear to have worked together as a kind of informal population management system, long before anything resembling organized medicine or policy existed. Now, there's one more piece of this that I want to address because it comes up every time this topic gets discussed, and it's a case where the science got it wrong and then had to walk it back. You may have heard of the Taung child. It's one of the most famous fossil skulls in paleoanthropology, a young Australopithecus discovered in South Africa in the 1920s. Anthropologist Raymond Dart examined the fracture patterns on that skull and argued that they showed evidence of deliberate killing, followed by cannibalism. For years, that interpretation sat in the academic record as evidence that early hominins were killing and eating their own children. Modern researchers have since concluded that interpretation was almost certainly wrong. The fracture patterns are now considered far more likely to be the result of predation by large birds, not deliberate violence by other hominins. The cannibalism narrative collapsed under closer scrutiny, and that connects to a broader warning that archaeologists now give about this entire field. Most Stone Age human societies routinely practiced infanticide, and estimates of children killed by infanticide in the Mesolithic and Neolithic eras vary from 15 to 50%, but researchers studying the archaeological record caution that a surface-level look at infant burials can create a false impression of mass deliberate killing. Extremely high natural infant mortality throughout most of human history produces similar burial patterns without any infanticide occurring at all. Seeing a lot of infant graves doesn't automatically mean you're looking at a killing ground. It might just mean that being a baby in most of human history was genuinely dangerous, and most of the danger came from nature, not from parents. There's also a controversial academic framework from sometimes called early infanticidal child-rearing that goes even further, arguing that certain ancient and tribal societies had structured, culturally normalized infanticide woven into how children were raised, not as an exception, but as a system. Most mainstream anthropologists reject that model as too broad and not well supported by the evidence. But the fact that it exists as a serious academic argument tells you something about how normalized and widespread this practice appears to have been across time and culture. If you're watching this and finding it genuinely hard to process, good. That's the right reaction. Because what this research is showing us is that the line between monstrous and rational is not where we think it is. These weren't people who didn't love their children. The evidence suggests the opposite, to that. These decisions were made precisely because of resource constraints, social realities, and survival pressures that we simply don't face anymore. That doesn't make it right, but it does make it human. And that's the uncomfortable truth sitting at the center of all of this. If this kind of deep dive into the darker corners of human history is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe, because this channel goes exactly where most people won't. And if you've got a take on this, or something you've read that adds to it, drop it in the comments. The best conversations on this channel happen down there, and I read them. Now here's what we actually learned today. Comparative anthropologists estimated that up to 50% of female newborns may have been killed during the Paleolithic era, a number that held up in academic literature until the rise of agriculture began changing the calculation. The most documented reasons across cultures were deformity or illness, uncertain paternity, and unfavorable circumstances for child rearing, not starvation. The Mackenzie-Dene census data showed the female population was reduced by 20% or more through selective infanticide, and that same data dismantled a decades-old disease theory about the same group. And the archaeological record, for all its infant graves, is far harder to read than it looks. You came into this video thinking this was about desperation and hunger. What it's actually about is decision-making. Cold, structured, socially driven decision-making that ran through most of human history, largely invisible, and only now being pieced together from census records, fracture patterns, and sex ratios in bones. The next video you should watch is right here. It goes just as deep, and it'll change something else you thought you already understood.